Ms. Ward, thank you so much for being on Buitenhof this morning. You've been reporting from the border region in northern Iraq, the Kurdistan region. Can you tell me what the situation is there currently?
Thank you so much for having me, Micah. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Well, the situation, I would say, changed a little bit last night when we heard President Trump basically dismiss the idea of Iranian Kurdish opposition forces getting involved with the fight in Iran. It was only 2 days before that, Micah, that President Trump had said it would be a beautiful thing that he would welcome for some of these forces to go in and launch some kind of a ground offensive in Western Iran. But now the president appears to have changed course and no longer wants to see these groups involved. You will feel and hear an audible sigh of relief across Iraqi Kurdistan at this news, because there had been real fears from the leadership here that any kind of involvement from Iranian Kurdish forces who are based here would result in severe retaliatory strikes from Iran. And the Iranian regime has told the Kurdish leadership over and over again, if any fighters come across that border, there will be hell to pay. So all of this had created a lot of tension on the ground. Now there's a sense that perhaps Iraqi Kurdistan can continue to try to maintain a neutral posture in this war. The people who are maybe less happy about this are some of these Iranian Kurdish opposition groups on the ground who were anticipating being involved in the fight with support from the US and Israel. But we haven't heard any official response from the coalition of the 6 different groups that are here.
Yeah, because yesterday, Al Jazeera reported that the leader of the Iranian Kurdish nationalist group said that it's highly likely that the Iranian Kurds would actually, in fact, stage a cross-border ground operation into Iran. But if I understand you correctly, that's now all up in the air because Donald Trump changed his mind?
I think it's up in the air. I do think it's possible that the Iranian Kurdish groups will decide to do something anyway on their own. And some of those groups have made it clear that they already have fighters inside Iran who are effectively kind of sleeper cells, who are ready to take action when they're given the word. I think the other thing we have to remember in all of this, okay, President Trump has said the US doesn't want to see the Iranian Kurdish groups getting involved. But what about Israel? Because we know that they have also been involved in supporting these groups. Do they believe that it is still in their interest for these groups to effectively foment some kind of civil unrest inside Iran? So I don't think we have all the answers yet. And then the other thing that I'm sure your viewers will be very aware of is that President Trump can say one thing one day, and 2 days later say something completely different, and 4 days later say something different again. So I think it's still a sense of watch this space. But for now in the region, I feel like people are finally breathing a sigh of relief that at least an imminent crisis has been averted, because it's important for people to understand that Erbil and Sulaymaniyah, which are the 2 main cities in Iraqi Kurdistan, have been getting hammered by Iranian missiles and drones. Partly that's been because of the US presence in this area, but it's also been because of the camps of these various different Iranian Kurdish groups that have been getting hit over and over again. And so the hope may be that now that President Trump has signified he doesn't want them involved, that maybe the intensity of those strikes against Erbil and Sulaymaniyah will start to lessen.
Yeah, at the same time, you reported earlier this week that actually support from the CIA to these Iranian Kurdish forces was already underway for months. So how does that relate to now this change in policy? What do the people there think of this?
So I would say 2 things. From our reporting, both on the ground here in Washington, D.C., we know that the CIA efforts began at least a few months before this war started. But what's not clear is the scale and the scope of this program. There's no indication that we were talking about heavy weaponry or training. It may have been more of along the lines of small arms and a lighter form of support, which could be a case of trying to keep your options open. As you prepare for a possible war with Iran, you're exploring different potential allies and you're looking at ways in which you might be able to support them.
Yeah.
So I don't think that this creates a huge tension with any previous efforts that the CIA has been engaged with to work with these groups. But certainly it puts a question mark as to what those efforts would look like going forward now. Would they continue? Do they stop completely? Does the US continue to try to keep its options open in the event that they do decide at some point that it is helpful to them? And the other possibility is that they sort of floated this and leaked this in a way to either A, be involved with some kind of psychological operation against the Iranian regime, but also B, to gauge what the reaction would be. And after our reporting came out, we saw a huge amount of reaction from across the board, really cautioning that this would be an incredibly reckless policy to pursue, precisely because there's no clear strategic objective. No one believes that Iranian Kurdish forces on their own could overthrow the Iranian regime. And so what you're looking at is the possibility that their involvement would simply be to try to factionalize Iran, to try to create chaos, to try to erode the territorial sovereign integrity of Iran. And so many people from within the United States government and security services and from across the region, I think, felt that that would be profoundly destabilizing and dangerous without any clear and markable upside.
Well, on that, a lot has been said about the shifting war aims of this administration within this war. In your experience as a war correspondent, which is significant, what does that generally tell you about the war itself? What does that mean when there's no clear war aim?
I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous, and you can absolutely feel the impact of that lack of clarity around the strategic objectives of this war on the ground, because there's a sense that this is being improvised in real time and different ideas are being floated or trialed, and one day it's regime change and Iranian people take to the streets and take back your country, and the next day it's much more focused on the nuclear program and ballistic missiles and the Navy, and then the next day again we're back to talking about Iranians taking to the streets and taking back their country. And it's very unusual when you're covering a war that you really have absolutely no idea of the direction that things are moving in. And it's also very unusual that you can't see any possible off-ramp, that there is no side channel of some kind of a diplomatic effort. And obviously, it's possible that there are talks going on in the background that we're not aware of. We have seen President Trump a number of times talk about the Venezuela model here and finding himself a Delcy Rodriguez, which is to say somebody within the Iranian establishment who would effectively be a puppet and work with the US and not fight them, but without the full effort of regime change, let's say. But there's no sense that there's somebody in Iran who matches that description. And unlike Venezuela, within the context of the Iranian regime, opposition to Israel and America is existential. So I'm not sure how you find someone who will no longer view the United States and Israel as an enemy who is still part of that establishment and regime. All of which is to say this war is making so many people incredibly nervous in this region, because there is a fear that this administration is not closely and carefully looking at the potential ripple effects and the fallout and the profound destabilizing effect, particularly here in Iraq, that all of this activity is having on the region.
Yeah, and this week we heard some quite aggressive war rhetoric coming from the White House. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, said they're toast and they know it. We only have just begun to hunt. In all your years as a war correspondent, have you ever heard rhetoric like this coming from the Pentagon?
I don't think we've heard rhetoric like this. I certainly don't think we have seen messaging like this. I'm not sure if your viewers have seen these videos that have been uploaded to the White House's social media accounts, which feature scenes from movies and scenes from video games, Call of Duty. There's a very sort of sophomoric, adolescent, go boys tone to all of this, which is really in stark contrast to what we, I think, have seen in the past. Obviously, when you had the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and everybody remembers President George Bush at the time standing on that aircraft carrier and saying, mission accomplished, right? So we have seen that type of bravado in the past. But this is on a whole new level. And I think the reason it makes so many feel kind of queasy and uncomfortable in this region is that it sounds immature on a certain level, and it sounds like there is a large degree of hubris there, and perhaps not a deeper understanding of the complexity of the knock-on effect and repercussions that this war is having across the region.
Yeah, and you just mentioned 2003 and the Iraq War. That was your first assignment in Iraq. That was also supposed to be a short war, but it turned out to be take up almost 9 years for American troops to withdraw. Do you perhaps feel like history is repeating?
Look, I think every war is different, but absolutely there is a sense of dread here, because we have seen this movie before. U.S. forces just completed their withdrawal in Iraq, their complete official withdrawal in Iraq, 2 months ago, in January, after more than 20 years.
Yeah.
Or exactly, I should say 20 years. So the idea that we would now be contemplating getting bogged down once again in a long and protracted conflict in the Middle East, I think beggars belief. And even domestically, this is not the platform that President Trump ran on. The promise that he made to American voters was not to get involved in these long conflicts, was not to get bogged down and to be spending billions of dollars. And so the question becomes, how does he square that promise that he made to voters with the potential that America is now slipping deeper into a conflict that by the day will become harder to extricate itself from?
You mentioned the domestic aspect, and part of his base, the MAGA base, they will say this is Israel's war. This is not America's war. And I heard you say on the podcast, The Rest is Classified, that there are people in the region you are in right now who believe the same thing. Is there any evidence that points into that direction, you think?
I think it's hard to talk about evidence, but certainly we are seeing a lot of commentators and representatives of MAGA in the US, but also a lot of analysts and experts who focus on this region, who say that there is clearly an interest from the Israeli side in fomenting political unrest in Iran, in seeing an Iran that is destabilized and chaotic, potentially for a long time to come. And that does not necessarily square with what the US interests or objective would be in this war. But again, given that we have not really got a clear sense from President Trump of exactly what the metric is here for victory from the American perspective, it's a little hard to see where this goes and what exactly the US expects to get out of it.
Yeah. You were in the Dutch television program College Tour a while ago when your book came out, and you spoke about life as a war correspondent and how one can almost get addicted to war. But I was thinking, you are now reporting in a country where you also started, so that spans 20 years. And I thought, isn't that also incredibly disheartening?
It's absolutely disheartening because I think you realize that we don't learn from history and we make the same mistakes over and over again. And the part of that which really saddens me and which sometimes gets lost in all the noise of war is that it's innocent, ordinary people who pay the price for that. Even here in Iraqi Kurdistan, where there haven't been a huge number of casualties, people just want to live a happy, secure life. They just want to be able to give their children a better future than what they have lived through. And the idea for this region of getting sucked back into potentially another generation of turmoil and bloodshed, honestly, it's profoundly depressing.
And as a
Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
So I mean, following up on that, as a journalist, what makes you keep going?
Well, I think there's a sense that we can't just throw in the towel. We can't just stop reporting. We can't be defeatist. And our job ultimately is not to implement policy or push for any given policy, but our job is to continue to make it clear to people the very real impact of those policies. And so, yes, it's disheartening, and yes, it's depressing, and yes, I would love to live in a world where we learn more from the lessons of history, but none of that changes my responsibility to keep doing this work and telling these stories.
On that, just to conclude, independent journalism is nearly impossible in Iran. You spoke out recently over the lack of independent journalism possible in Gaza. It's under pressure everywhere. But as a war reporter, what are the consequences when journalists have no access?
The consequences are that the stories become about geopolitics and not about human beings. And that is very dangerous. And the fact that, and I should say that my colleague Fred Pleitgen is currently on the ground in Iran, and which is extraordinary. He's there at the invitation of the Iranian government, which entails many things, as you can probably imagine, and makes it a very challenging job for him. But it is absolutely better to have someone on the ground than no one. And in this story, I have absolutely been struck by the fact that we haven't been getting a deep and intimate enough picture of what Iranians are going through, of the fear, of the moments of elation, of the chaos, of the turmoil, of the violence, of this intense bombardment. And that flattens a story. And as a journalist on the outside, you feel like you're looking in a keyhole. You're looking in a keyhole and you can only just get a tiny picture of what's going on. And the stories that you tell, they lack the intimacy, the humanity that comes with being on the ground and being able to talk to people and tell their stories in real time.
Yeah. Ms. Clarissa Ward, thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Bedankt voor het kijken. Vond je dit nou een goed gesprek? Vergeet dan niet te abonneren of te liken. Reageren in de comments kan natuurlijk ook. Meer interviews zien over geopolitiek? Klik dan hiernaast.